This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Hello, everybody. Dr. Alison Griffiths is a native of Wales in the United Kingdom. She has several university degrees that include a bachelor's degree from the University of Leicester in England, a master's in arts from the University of London, and a doctorate from New York University. Today, she is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk, Dr. Griffith.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
You have spent your whole distinguished academic career studying how certain aspects of society are represented in the media. And why do you choose to do that? Because not many people seem to be really interested in that kind of things.
So I'm very interested in how cinema can be useful, can challenge some of our norms about how we see the world. And starting with my master's degree, I was very interested in how Welsh national and cultural identity was inscribed in a very long-running soap opera in Wales called Poblacion, People of the Valley. And so I'm interested in cinema and its ability to tell provocative stories about people, and especially people that don't have much power, don't have much capital in terms of their ability to kind of break into mainstream filmmaking or Hollywood. So in my earliest projects, I looked at how Native peoples all around the world had been shown in early ethnographic films made primarily before 1920. And in a more recent project, I looked at prisoners on film. So I'm interested in people who are somewhat at the margins of our society and our culture, because I think they have some of the most interesting stories to tell.
Now, I don't think many people in this country understand the big cultural differences in even countries that look small to us, like the United Kingdom.
Right.
And I was wondering to what extent you can explain to our audience how different it is for people to feel Welsh versus English versus Scottish or Irish.
Absolutely, and in the wake of Brexit, this is a really provocative question to ask now in terms of how do we define notions of identity within the United Kingdom. Growing up in Wales and being Welsh is really quite a unique experience, especially if you speak Welsh. And even though I not claim to be a native Welsh speaker, I certainly grew up in a community and have older brothers who are Welsh speakers. And so what I was interested in doing in my research is thinking about how certain kind of notions of Welshness in terms of a kind of a collective feeling of shared identity, but also defining oneself in opposition to the English. And so in this soap opera, I took a storyline that had been called the invasion storyline, which was about an English family moving to a small community and how they were received by the locals. And there's some ambivalence and anxiety about the English going back centuries. The Wales in many ways has a kind of a neo-colonialist relationship to England, and so when people talk about, you're from England, I go, no, I'm not. I'm actually from Wales. I do understand quite a large amount of Welsh spoken. I'm very proud to be Welsh, and I think that we have. Obviously, we share similarities with the Scottish and the Irish and the English, but I think in terms of landscape, geography, cultural history, identity, and especially the language, I think that makes us quite unique and quite distinct.
When I see or watch movies produced in the United Kingdom, you can tell very much the difference of the cultural background of each one, particularly when it gravitates around lower middle class people.
Right.
And even I have seen some versions of those movies that are actually subtitled in English, because although they are spoken in English, it is hard to understand what they are saying.
That's right. I've actually been to screenings at the New York Film Festival where English films have been subtitled. Films that are located in Glasgow or in the north of England are subtitled. And what's interesting is that having now lived in New York for 20 some years, I sometimes too will have to listen extra hard to hear certain words, because I'm now not used to listening to a very thick Newcastle, what we call a Geordie accent, or a very thick Birmingham Brummie accent. Although it's interesting, after about 10, 15 minutes or so, I can begin to kind of hear the accent again. But yes, I mean, it's always a very sort of disconcerting feeling to see someone speaking English and having their words translated on screen
into English.
Yes, I mean, there's one questions its necessity, but it's certainly a convention.
And it's funny because I think you have lost some of your accent by living here. And I had a colleague of mine who was from England, from Manchester.
Right.
And she told me that when she goes back there, she's taking us for an American. And
right.
For us, she speaks with the British accent.
Well, it's interesting. My students will often say, where in Australia or South Africa are you from? People think I have a sort of a mid-Atlantic accent. And yet when I'm back in Wales, my kids will say, you're sounding very Welsh again. So, and yet I have friends who have been here 20, 30 years and sound as English as the day they stepped off the plane. So,
now going back to your area of work, there is a question that sounds like complicated, but I think it's fundamental in your area of expertise, which is to what extent the cultural framework shape the way movies present certain cultures, and to what extent then certain movies portray cultures in a way that they are different what they really are, and how that creates stereotypes, because sometimes you see, okay, which part of this is reality, which part of this is pure fiction.
Right. So, I classify myself as an early cinema historian. I'm someone who's very interested in the power of visual images. And I think that visual images clearly can contain, significant amounts of authenticity, of sort of notions of the real, right? That sense that somebody was actually there with a camera. And yet they're constantly framed, right? And I think that we need to always have a sort of healthy measure of skepticism when we're thinking about the mediating effect of the camera and the mediating effect of whoever's there behind the camera. So I think this question of framing is really, really interesting. And what I was trying to do was not just simply look at the films as these kind of as sort of textual evidence, but also looking at the larger context in how they were made, where they were shown, and how they were then framed either by the presence of a lecturer, either by the institution. So where they were shown often shaped their meaning. So for example, in the early cinema period, you might have films of, say, Australian Aboriginal people, and these might be shown at a Nickelodeon, in which case there might be a very derogatory commentary, there might be a lecturer who would make fun of their differences, etc., refer to them as being sort of lesser than human, or they might be shown at the British Academy of Sciences or some other scientific institution, and their scientific interests would therefore be drawn out. So these films would enunciate their meanings in quite different ways depending on how they were framed and where they were shown. What's interesting now is that we can read these films on so many different levels. I mean, they're evidence of colonialism, they're evidence of scientific investigation, they're evidence of cultural encounters. They're artifacts of memory for the descendants of the native peoples. They can sometimes be used as part of an activism campaign to argue that people have been practicing and that have claim to land going back over 100 years. So they can be made to utter what it is you want them to utter in very specific ways. What's wonderful now is that these films are much more accessible than they've ever been before, thanks to the archive being sort of opened up to scholars.
Yeah. One of your areas of work has been to look at how Native Americans have been portrayed, particularly in early American cinema.
Right.
And when you see those movies, whether from the silent era, maybe all the way to the 50s, even the 60s,
Right.
the portrayal of Native American didn't change that much.
Right.
Basically, were these savages that were very dangerous, that were going to kill you, and that sort of things. And I was wondering to what extent that portrayal of them really had a social impact on the consciousness of the country regarding Native Americans?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think that when we look at many of the crimes that were committed against the first Americans, the kind of first peoples of the United States, many of the movies that were made about them, I think, can be added to that long list of wrongs that have been done to them. Having said that, though, I do think that it's possible, especially with films that were made on reservations or films that were made with Native peoples as opposed to Western actors dressing up as Native Americans. Those films, I think, can be recuperated, right? I think the meanings of those films, which might originally have been linked to very racist narratives and discourses, I think that we can kind of break those films free and really think about them again as these kind of records that can mean different things and that have some interest for anthropologists but also for the communities. But to go back to your larger question, which is what was the larger impact? I mean, I think what happened from the very beginning, I mean, some of the earliest Native American films kind of played into some of the cultural stereotypes. But we should be mindful of the fact that Native Americans were employed gainfully employed in popular culture, and were some of them quite happy to make a living performing versions of their culture which they knew would be consumable. Yeah. So Native Americans traveled with the Buffalo Bill troupe. Yes. They went to Thomas Edison's studio. They made films in 1895. What you then see, however, is this nascent Hollywood industry capitalizing on the kind of visual appeal and all the sort of stereotypical notions of Indianness that went with that, and making early Westerns from 1907 onwards that had the most predictable racist, highly problematical narratives in terms of people, being unable to kind of assimilate, not wanting to assimilate, or, really never feeling comfortable with their native identity. So all of these kinds of issues, and also just horrible images of savagery and, just there's a D.W. Griffith film from 1915 called The Battle of Elderbush Gulch, and, you see Native Americans eating dog. I mean, they're the worst kind of savage stereotypes that you've ever seen. So these films were very difficult to kind of then undo in terms of a sort of a national consciousness.
Talking about that, you mentioned the word stereotypes a couple of times, and I wonder, it's no question that in some cases they emphasize further some of the stereotypes, but I suspect also sometimes they have created stereotypes out of nothing. And I was thinking, for example, in movies, particularly in the 50s and 60s, that were portraying gay people, that they once mostly portrayed as sick people, deviant, and all that sort of things. Right. And I was wondering, in your studies, to what extent you have seen the stereotype being almost created out of nothing in these movies?
Right. I'm not a huge student of popular cinema in some ways. I mean, I'm someone who's very interested in the more kind of esoteric films that are at the margins. So, I mean, I think clearly there are many occasions when we could say that stereotypes are kind of constructed. But I think it's rare that stereotypes come out of nowhere. I mean, I think they're often grounded in fears and anxieties, often anxieties that are projected onto other people. A community that I've obviously got to know a lot recently would be prisoners. And I think that, again, we see sort of essences of a kind of a carceral identity that in some ways is grounded in a certain reality, but it's often magnified. It's often then turned into and sort of pathologized into a stereotype that's completely out of control. So the idea of the kind of hyper-masculine male, which clearly there are lots of people like that in prison, but when it becomes such a default, just a sort of an automatic knee-jerk character that is created, I think there's a real flattening of our understanding of what incarceration and a prison community looks like. So absolutely, I mean, I think that stereotypes, absolutely pervasive, grow like sort of embryos and sort of develop into kind of monstrous types. And I think that we have a certain comfort level with them, I think, in some ways. I mean, they're these sort of shorthands. But I also think that it's really important, especially with our students, that we give them the kind of critical tools to unthink them, or at least to kind of confront them and address them, and to at least engage in sort of dialogue with where these images come from and why.
Your latest book, titled Carceral Fantasies, I found fascinating that you look at something that most people don't look at, is how certain captive audiences relate to movies,
right?
Especially when those movies somehow touch some of their daily life experiences. And for example, when you mentioned that there were certain prisons where movies were forbidden altogether, to others where there was some kind of censorship of which movies can be shown to the prisoners, to others in which basically they didn't care what you were seeing. And I was wondering, what you found in terms of the response of those people who were spending years in prison about how they saw the world was changing through these movies?
Well, that's a fascinating question and somewhat tricky to get at in terms of archival research. So this project was very much grounded in looking at some of the earliest instances of prisoners as moviegoers, right? And so what I was looking for was ways of kind of accessing an inmate's subjectivity in terms of what did they think of cinema. I mean, imagine what this must feel like, right? And in some ways, cinema was conducted like a social experiment. What would it be like to show people, I mean, almost in a kind of a perverse way, what would it be like to show people the real world when that's the thing that eludes them, right? So it is like this kind of social scientific setup. And so what I was trying to do was get at both how early cinema represented this community, but then how this community then responded to these representations. And there is evidence. There is evidence, photographic evidence. There's visual evidence of inmates in screenings where a photographer was present. And not surprisingly actually, they shield their faces from the camera because for whatever reason they did not want to be shown in the mainstream media in prison. For whatever reason, their pride, their ego, shame, some of them mugged for the camera, some of them smiled for the camera. So those images give us some really interesting clues as to what it was like to be a spectator inside prison, where you would not necessarily want to be identified. There's a wonderful instance of alias Jimmy Valentine being shown at Sing Sing prison in 1915, where prisoners are watching themselves on screen, marching into the mess hall, because even though it's a fiction film, it used actuality sequences of inmates, documentary sequences, which were then integrated into the film. So that must have been a really bizarre experience, to be watching yourself on screen in a state of incarceration. So it would be wonderful to travel into a portal and to go back and ask these inmates what they thought of experiencing cinema. My ally in this project was the mainstream press, because they were absolutely fascinated with the idea of inmates watching film. In fact, so much so that when inmates decided not to watch film, that was deemed newsworthy. So there were little articles. Inmates refused to go to cinema. Inmates didn't want to go and watch film. Why? What's wrong with them? So cinema going and displaying normal reactions to cinema were barometers of inmate health. And there is an interesting discussion of, were they reacting normally? Like if a comedy was being shown and an inmate wasn't laughing, that inmate might be singled out as, what's wrong with him? Why isn't he displaying normal reactions? So here's cinema that's useful in so many different ways. And I'm borrowing the term useful cinema from film scholars Heidi Wasson and Charles Ackland, who actually published an anthology called Useful Cinema, which thinks about cinema having a utility in terms of, in the case of prison, disciplining, rewarding, normalizing, doing all kinds of things above and beyond what it does when it's shown in mainstream culture.
Another thing I learned by reading your book is early on in the history of cinema, there were a lot of films made of executions. And I was wondering, what's the purpose of doing that kind of exemplary, to tell people if you misbehave, this may happen to you? Or there was some kind of morbo by the general public to see someone being killed?
Right. So what cinema was essentially doing when it occasionally filmed actual executions, it was much more the norm to reconstruct executions for the camera. And even though I'm underscoring a difference here, I mean, in many ways, I think the kind of visual trauma of watching an execution, albeit reconstructed or real, I mean, that's the larger point here, is that why did filmmakers feel that there was a sort of market value in reconstructing someone's moment of death? Well, there are no secrets here that people have been fascinated with executions going way back. There was a riot in Albany in the 19th century when people couldn't squish into enough space, and there was a kind of a print media that built up around it. So the idea of the kind of public spectacle, right, the kind of scaffold dance, was something that had been around for a very long time. Were these films effective in terms of serving as kind of moral parables to prevent crime? Absolutely not. There's very little evidence. In fact, what the public wanted was more artifacts. So Leon Czolgosz, who assassinated President McKinley, there was a huge demand to have his body, which somebody in Brooklyn wanted to display at a Brooklyn museum. They had to dispose of the body very quickly because they feared that it would be stolen from the grave. So any artifacts of execution were incredibly prized because audiences and people then and now are absolutely fascinated with the kind of artifacts of death and scandal, as Madame Tussauds and waxworks and chambers of horrors attest to this day.
Yeah. Well, I found, for example, the story that some people tried to steal Lincoln's body.
Right.
Tells you that there was some fixation with these death things.
Right. And, my students often ask me why. Why is there this kind of fascination? Why did people write to Warden Lewis Laws in Sing Sing requesting to be a witness to electrocution? Because it was a state mandate that there had to be 12 people
witnesses
present as witnesses. No women were allowed, but men were allowed. Mm-hmm. Journalists obviously were given access to. And there were people who not only wrote repeatedly to secure a seat, but were volunteering to pull the switch, volunteering to, there's a real kind of prurient fascination with looking at something that obviously awaits us all. There's this sense that, well, that is not me. There's that separation of self and other at that moment. Yeah. It was at Sing Sing, as in any other prison, staged, framed like a very perverse performance. I mean, everybody knew their places. It had to run like clockwork, and the witnesses sat in pews. The very similar pews where the prisoners sat to watch films. So the chapel where films were shown and the death house shared the same sort of internal architecture and furniture. So, but I'm not a psychologist of execution, so I can't really dig much deeper than that in terms of why people would want to watch them. But there's footage of Saddam Hussein's execution leaked out on cell phone.
And they are all over the internet, that sort of things.
Absolutely.
The other question is how different was the portrayal of women being incarcerated versus men in terms of the public consciousness of a woman being in jail? Because a lot of people in certain time, not now, but thought women in jail, that's very rare.
Right. So there Certainly are films showing women prisoners around about the same time as the male films. The Detroit House of Correction had women inmates, and they're shown marching to the mess hall. Certainly in terms of images of women prisoners in the kind of historical archive, there are lots of images.
Yeah.
Women are kind of constructed as different types of prisoners. In some ways, women are seen as being higher maintenance than men. Women are, again, a kind of pervasive stereotype is the idea of women acting out, that women would sort of lose it in their cells. They would rip their books, rip their clothing, destroy the place, and that the silent system, which was a method of punishment in the 19th century where inmates were prevented from speaking to one another, that was seen as being much more harmful and difficult for women to deal with. So again, lots of kind of sort of social stereotypes come into play. But with regards to images of women prisoners, I mean, I think that incarceration and femininity are deeply kind of troubled as sort of concepts, right? And I think that, I mean, certainly when you look at films from the 1930s onwards, you see sort of classic Hollywood films, which in many ways take some of the similar narratives, right? I mean, the sort of wronged woman, or the sort of inmate who's misunderstood or bullied, whatever. But what I was especially interested in was how state apparatus dealt with women prisoners differently in terms of their access to popular culture. Mm-hmm. And so what I discovered was that whereas men were shown motion pictures in prisons starting roughly around 1907, women were shown films much later, certainly based on my research in New York State. And this raises an interesting question as to why cinema would be seen as perfectly fine to show to men, but not to women. And what I sort of speculated here was that women were incarcerated for crimes that men would never be incarcerated for, right? So for drunkenness, lewd behavior, prostitution, simply being out on the street. One woman I came across was incarcerated for 30 days for being out on the street without wearing stockings. I mean, just these absolutely crazy, surreal sort of stories. Yeah. And so in many ways, cinema as part of popular culture was, some carceral experts argued, the reason why women ended up in prison in the first place, right? Because during the early cinema period, motion picture houses, cheap amusements were spaces that were seen as quite dangerous for women, and that respectable women wouldn't have gone there. So why would you reward women with motion pictures when the motion picture industry itself at this time, before it was fully formed, had certain kind of negative connotations? And even though women labored in prison, I think women's work was seen as less valuable in prison than men's work. So men would go to the workshops, put in a hard day's work, and they were rewarded for their labor by watching film. Women weren't rewarded in similar ways. So there are, I think, sort of cultural stereotypes at play. And then there are also some concerns that putting all the women together and watching a film that might get them too excited could pose a potential kind of security situation. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Dr. Alison Griffiths for this very interesting conversation about cinema and society and how we view things through cinema and how also cinema portrays about our own society. And next week, we're going to have Dr. John Bregman of the Department of English, who will be talking about modern American literature. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2016.